There is a hollow in the Blue Ridge that stopped appearing on maps sometime around 1911, not abandoned, not flooded, erased. The roads that once led into Hangman's Cove were struck from the county survey. The families who lived there were scraped out of the census, and for more than 100 years almost nobody who knew the truth ever said it out loud. The people who lived in that cove were called the Ferriers. They worked iron in a furnace that, by every honest measurement, was older than the state around it. Depending on who you ask, they were either the most gifted metal workers the southern mountains ever produced, or a bloodline that should never have been allowed to continue. Today, for the first time, the record has been put back together, and what it shows is far worse than the stories that survived it. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the Ferrier bloodline ledger, the 29 names struck from the county census, the baptism dates scraped out of the parish register, and the council's own signed order to erase them, word for word I put it all into a written document. It's linked below and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. To understand the Ferriers, you have to understand the Cove itself, because the two were never really separate. Hangman's Cove sits in a fold of the mountains where 3 ridgelines press together and the sun only reaches the valley floor for a few hours a day. Even in high summer, the frost lingers in the shadowed corners. The official history says the first settlers arrived in the 1790s, families pushing west with nothing but axes and hope. The stonework in that cove says otherwise. Along the creek that runs through it there are foundations laid in a dry-fit style that no frontier family had the tools or the numbers to build. Blocks the size of coffins, cut so clean you cannot slide a knife blade between them, arranged in walls that follow no property line anyone ever recorded. The Ferriers did not build those walls. Every account we have agrees on that single point. They found them, and they built their furnace on top of them. The name itself tells you something, if you listen. A ferrier, in the old spelling, is a worker of iron, a farrier, a shaper of the hard metal that the mountain hides. But the cove had a second name, older than the family, and that name was Hangman's. Nobody living can tell you who was hanged there, or when, or why the gallows came before the town. The surveyors who first mapped the region marked the spot with that word already attached, as if the place had been waiting for the people who would earn it. The Ferriers moved into a valley that was already named for death, built on foundations they could not explain, and went to work as though they had been called there. Some of the oldest people in the surrounding hollows insisted the family had not chosen the cove at all. They said the cove had chosen the family, the way the right key finds the right lock, and that the Ferriers had simply been the ones whose blood fit what was already waiting in the ground. The furnace is where the story truly turns. Iron smelting in early Appalachia was crude, dangerous work. Small bloomery pits, choked with charcoal, producing brittle and uneven metal that a good smith had to fight for hours to make useful. What came out of the Ferrier furnace was not that. Tools stamped with their mark, a simple ring split by a single line, turned up across 3 states, and the blacksmiths who handled them wrote letters to one another trying to work out how the metal had been made. It held an edge it had no business holding. It did not rust the way honest iron rusts. One county surveyor, in the year 1847, described a Ferrier blade that had been left lying in a creek bed for the better part of a decade and came out of the water clean, bright, and sharp. He wrote in his notes that the family would not say where the ore came from, only that, in his words, the mountain gave it, and the mountain would one day want it back. That single line got him quietly removed from his post. His survey of the cove was never filed with the county. His replacement was instructed not to go up the road at all. There is a detail in those blacksmith's letters that most people skip past, and it is the one that should stop you cold. Iron rusts because it wants to return to the ground it came from. That is simple chemistry. Ferrier iron did not do that. Left in water, left in salt, left in the open weather for years, it stayed exactly as it was made. Whatever came out of that furnace did not want to go back to the earth, and men who spent their lives at a forge understood, without being able to say it plainly, that they were holding something that broke a rule the whole world runs on. They stopped trading for it. Not because it was poor, because it was too good. in a way that made the hair on their arms stand up. For a while, the strangeness was tolerated, because the work was simply too good to lose. A Ferrier axe head would outlast 3 ordinary ones. A Ferrier plough blade cut ground that broke other iron. But tolerance in the mountains has always had a short reach, and the reasons to look away were piling up. The Ferriers did not marry out. In 4 full generations, the parish register shows the same 6 surnames circling back on themselves, cousins, wedding cousins, until the family tree stopped being a tree at all and became a closed and tightening loop. Children were born inside that cove who lived their entire lives there and were never once seen at market, never baptized in the open church, never counted by any man who did not already belong. Travellers who spent a single night in Hangman's Cove came away describing a smell they could not place, something metallic and sweet at the same time, and a sound from the furnace that continued long into the night, long after the fire should have burned itself down to ash. And then there were the ones who went up the road and did not come back. Not Ferriers, outsiders. A peddler working his circuit through the hollows. A travelling preacher who meant to save them and was never seen again. 2 men sent up by a merchant in the valley to collect on a debt the family had let run too long. Each of them went up the Cove Road in good health, told someone where they were going, and then the Cove Road, quietly and without any fuss at all, simply forgot them. No bodies, no belongings, no graves. When anyone asked, the Ferriers only said the same thing they always said. The mountain took what it was owed, and each time an outsider vanished into that fold of the ridges, the very next batch of iron out of the furnace was said to be the finest the family ever made. The preacher is the one people remember, because he left a diary. He was a circuit man named Absalom Reed, and he wrote that he intended to spend 3 days in the cove and bring the Ferriers to God, whether they wanted it or not. His final entry was written on the 2nd night. He described a supper where the family said grace in a language he did not recognize, older than Latin, he thought, and older than anything a mountain family should have known. He wrote that when he opened his Bible to read, the eldest Ferrier gently closed it with one hand and told him, kindly, that the cove already had its own arrangement and had kept it a very long time. Reed wrote that he meant to leave at first light. The diary ends there. It was found in the crook of a tree at the mouth of the Cove Road a full year later, dry and unmarked, as though someone had set it out where it would be sure to be found. Reed never was. Before we move on to what happened the winter, the cove went silent, stopped for a second. What you just heard about the furnace and the men who never came back is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the council's own minutes. The missing census years, the names that repeat. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. In the spring of the year 1911, the county convened a session that does not appear in any published record of its proceedings. Officially, that meeting never happened. The minutes survive for one reason only, which is that a young clerk, frightened by what he was writing down, kept a private copy for himself and hid it. That copy is the reason we can tell this part of the story at all. 11 men met behind a locked door in the county seat. No press, no public, no record meant to last. The single subject listed on the agenda was one word, underlined, Ferrier. What followed was not a trial. There was no charge read aloud, no defence offered, no verdict entered into any book. What those 11 men authorised instead was an erasure, and they were methodical about it. The census pages covering the entire cove were to be physically removed. The parish register was to be, in their own careful phrasing, corrected. The roads leading up to Hangman's Cove were to be struck from the next county survey and left off every map that followed. And the family itself, all 29 living men, women, and children, was to be relocated by whatever means the situation required. The clerk underlined that final phrase twice in his private copy, and beside it, in the cramped margin, he wrote 3 words of his own that no official would ever have allowed: God forgive us. He did not write what the men had discussed behind that door before they reached the decision. He wrote only that after it was made, not one of the 11 would look another in the eye. What happened after that? The official record cannot tell you, because the official record was the very thing being fed into the fire. But the private copy continues, and it is not gentle. Through the long winter of 1911, wagons went up the Cove road empty and came back down covered with tarpaulins, riding low on their axles. The furnace, which the family's own account claimed had burned without a single recorded stop for well over a century, went cold for the first time in living memory. And in the parish register, beneath the very last Ferrier baptism, in a hand entirely different from the entries around it, someone wrote a single line and then closed the book. It did not record a death. It read simply, "Return to the mountain." No dates, no graves. Not one body from Hangman's Cove was ever laid in consecrated county ground. 29 people who were alive and counted in the spring did not exist by the thaw, and the paperwork that might have proven either the living or the dying had already gone to ash. One account, and only one, suggests that a single Ferrier got out. A girl, somewhere between 10 and 12 years old, was supposedly taken in by a family 2 counties east and raised under a different surname entirely. She never spoke of where she came from, but those who knew her late in life said she would not go near an open flame, that she flinched at the sound of a hammer on iron, and that once, only once, when a grandchild asked her about the mountains, she said that the walls in the Cove were there before the first people, that her family had only ever been keepers, and that keepers are not supposed to be freed. Then she never spoke of it again. Whether that girl was real, or a story stitched together to give the horror a survivor, nobody can say. But her single reported line is the only testimony we have from inside the bloodline itself, and it points at exactly the thing the 11 men were trying to bury. Because here is what truly troubles the people who have now read the reconstructed ledger from beginning to end. The erasure worked. For a full century, Hangman's Cove was a blank space on the map, a place with no families, no recorded history, and no reason for anyone to look closer at the shadows in that fold of the mountains. But the stonework is still there. Anyone willing to hike in can find it. The coffin-sized blocks, the walls that follow no line a surveyor ever drew, the deep foundations that the Ferriers found already waiting and did not build. Whoever cut and set that stone was standing in that cove long before the 1790s, long before the tidy timeline we were all handed in school allows anyone to have been standing anywhere in those mountains at all. And that is the part the 11 men could not burn. The Ferriers were never the beginning of this story. They were the last chapter of something far older, a single bloodline that had been tending that furnace and feeding that mountain for far longer than any census would ever admit on paper, keepers of a place that was named for the gallows before a gallows was ever built. The men in that locked room did not put an end to it. They did not have that kind of power. All they managed to do was bury it, scrape it off the record, and hope the mountain would stay quiet with the door shut. And if the stories from the hollows nearest the Cove are worth anything at all, the mountain has not stayed quiet. Hunters still avoid that valley. The frost still holds in the corners, and on certain still nights, people who live closest swear you can hear something down in the Cove that sounds a great deal like a furnace, breathing. There is one more thing in the clerk's private copy, near the very end, that nobody likes to talk about. He wrote that when the last wagon came down the Cove road in the deep of that winter, the man driving it was asked whether it was finished, whether the Ferriers were truly gone, and the driver, who had made that trip up and down for weeks, would not answer the question directly. He said only that you cannot relocate keepers. You can move the people, he said, but the thing they were keeping does not go with them. It stays, it waits, and it counts. Then he asked for his pay, and he left the county, and he was never heard from in those parts again. The document linked below is the full reconstruction, every name they struck from the census, every baptism date they scraped out of the register. Every line the frightened clerk wrote down because he could not carry it alone. Read it, all of it, and then decide for yourself what the mountain gave the Ferriers across all those silent generations, and what, in the winter of 1911, it finally came back to collect. If this is the kind of history you believe should never have been buried, subscribe. Every single week I take another erased place and put it back on the map where it belongs. The full Ferrier record is waiting in the description. Keep it somewhere a flame can't reach. I'll see you at the next cove.